Hello everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of Crackling Tales. The story that I have for you today is by an author named Avram Davidson. Here's a little bit about him. This story was written in July of 1961. Avram Davidson is a well-known not only to readers of mysteries, but also to readers of science fiction and fantasy. He served as editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction for several years, and was a winner of the Hugo Award and the World Fantasy Award 3 times, in addition to the Edgar Award. This story appears in a book called Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine Presents 50 Years of Crime and Suspense. The story is called The Cost of Kent Castwell. The Cost of Kent Castwell by Avram Davidson. Clem Goodhue met the train with his taxi. If old Mrs. Merriman were aboard, he would be sure of at least one passenger. Furthermore, old Mrs. Merriman had somehow gotten the idea that the minimum fare was $1. It was really 75 cents, but Clem had never been able to see a reason for telling her that. However, she was not aboard that morning. Sam Wells was. He was coming back from the city. He'd been in to put a claim to have his pension increased, but Sam Wells wouldn't pay 5 cents to ride any distance under 5 miles. Clem disregarded him. After old Sam, a thin, brown-haired kid got off the train. Next came a girl, also thin and also brown-haired, whom Clem thought was maybe the kid's teenage sister. Actually, it was the kid's mother. After that came Kent Castwell. Clem had seen him before, early in the summer. Strangers were not numerous in Ashby, particularly strangers who got ugly and caused commotions in bars. So Clem wouldn't forget him in a hurry. Big, husky fellow, always seemed to be sneering at something. But the girl and the kid hadn't been with him then. "Taxi?" Clem called. Castwell ignored him, began to take luggage down from the train, but the young girl holding the kid by the hand turned and said, "Yes, just a minute." "Where to?" Clem asked, when the luggage was in the taxi. "The old Peabody place," the girl said. "Do you know where that is?" "Yes, but nobody lives there anymore." "Somebody does now. Us." The big man swore as he fiddled with the handle of the right-hand door. It was tied with ropes. "Why don't you fix this thing or get a new one?" "Cost money," Clem said. "Then, Peabody place. Have to charge you $3 for that." "Let's go, damn it, let's go." After they'd started off, Castwell said, "I'm giving you $2, probably twice what it's worth anyway." Half turning his head, Clem protested, "I told you, mister, it was 3. "And I'm telling you, mister," Castwell mimicked the driver's New England accent, "that I'm giving you 2. Clem argued that the Peabody place was far out. He mentioned the price of gas, the bad condition of the road, the wear on the tires. The big man yawned. Then he used a word that Clem rarely used himself and never in the presence of women and children. But this young woman and child didn't seem to notice. "Stop off at Nickerson's real estate office," Castwell said. Levi P. Nickerson, who was also the county tax assessor, said, "Mr. Castwell, I assume this is Mrs. Castwell?" "If that's your assumption, go right ahead," said Kent, and he laughed. It wasn't a pleasant laugh. The woman smiled faintly, so L.P. Nickerson allowed himself an economical chuckle. Then he cleared his throat. City people had odd ideas of what was funny. Meanwhile, though, "Now, Mr. Castwell, about this place you're renting. I didn't realize, you didn't mention, that you had this little one here." Kent said, "What if I didn't mention it? It's my own business. Look, I haven't got all day." Nickerson pointed out that the Peabody place stood all alone, isolated with no other house for at least a mile, and no other children in the neighborhood. Mrs. Castwell, if indeed she was, said that this wouldn't matter much, because Kathy would be in school most of the day. School. Well, that's it, you see. The school bus, in the first place, will have to go 3 miles off what's been its regular route to pick up your little girl. And that means the road will have to be plowed regular. Snow gets real deep up in these parts, you know. Up till now, with nobody living in the old Peabody place, we never had to bother with the road. Now, this means, and he began to count off on his fingers, first, it'll cost Ed Westlake, he drives the school bus, more than he figured on when he bid for the contract. Second, it'll cost the county to keep your road open. That's besides the cost of the girls' schooling, which is third. Kent Castwell said, well, that was tough, wasn't it? Let's have the keys, Nick, he said. A flicker of distaste at the familiarity crossed the real estate man's face. You don't seem to realize that all this extra expense to the county isn't covered by the tax assessment on the Peabody place, he pointed out. Now, it just so happens that there's a house right on the outskirts of town, become available this week. Miss Sarah Beach passed on, and her sister, Miss Lavinia, moved in with her married sister, Mrs. Calvin Adams. 'Twon't cost you any more, and it would save us considerably. Castwell, sneering, got up. What? Me live where some old maid landlady can be on my neck all the time about messing up her pretty things? No thanks. He held out his hands. The keys, kid. Gimme the key. Mr. Nickerson gave him the keys. Afterward, he was to say, and to say often, that he wished he'd thrown them into Lake Amonstanquet instead. The income of the Castwell menage was not large, and consisted of a monthly check and a monthly money order. The check came on the 15th from a city trust company and was assumed by some to be inherited income. Others argued in favor of it being a remittance paid by Castwell's family to keep him away. The money order was made out to Louise Kane and signed by an army sergeant in Alaska. The young woman said this was alimony and that Sergeant Burndahl was her former husband. Tom Tolley, at the grocery store, had her sign the endorsement twice, as Louise Kane and as Louise Castwell. Tom was a cautious man. Castwell gave Louise a hard time. There was no doubt about that. She so much as walked in between the sofa, on which he spent most of his time, and the television, he'd leap up and belt her. More than once, both she and the kid had to run out of the house to get away from him. He wouldn't follow, as a rule, because he was barefooted, as a rule, and it was too much trouble to put his shoes on. Lie on the sofa and drink beer and watch television all afternoon, and hitch into town and drink bar whiskey and watch television all evening. That was Kent Castwell's daily schedule. He got to know who drove along the road regularly, at what time, and in which direction, and he'd be there, waiting. There was more than one who could have dispensed with the pleasure of his company in their car, but he'd get out in the road and wave his arms and not move until the car he got in front of stopped. What could you do about it? Put him in jail? Sure you could. He hadn't been living there a week before he got into a fight in the Ashby bar. Disturbing the peace, using profane and abusive language, and resisting arrest, that will be $10 or 10 days on each of the charges, said Judge Paltiel Bradford, and count yourself lucky it's not more, pay the clerk. But Castwell, his ugly leer in no way improved by the dirt and bruises on his face, said, I'll take the jail. Judge Bradford's long jaw set and then loosened. Look here, Mr. Castwell, that was just legal language on my part. The jail is closed up. Hasn't been anybody in there since July. It was then November. It would have to be heated and illuminated and the water turned on and a guard hired. To say nothing of feeding you. Now, I don't say why the county should be put to all that expense on your account. You pay the clerk $30. You haven't got it on you? Take it until tomorrow. Well, I'll take the jail. It's most inconvenient. Well, that's too bad, Your Honor. The judge glared at him. Gamaliel Coolidge, the district attorney, stood up. Perhaps the court would care to suspend sentence, he suggested, seeing it is the defendant's first offense. The court did care. But the next week, Kent was back again on the same charge. Altogether, the sentence now came to $60 or 60 days. And again, Kent Castwell chose jail. I don't generally do this, said the judge, fuming, but I'll let you pay your fine off in installments, considering you have a wife and child. I'll take the jail. "You won't like the food," warned His Honor. Castwell said he guessed the food would be up to the legal requirements. If it wasn't, he said the State Board of Prison Inspectors would hear about it. Some pains were taken to see that the food served Kent during his stay in jail was a little beyond the legal requirements, if not much beyond. The last time the State Board had inspected the county jail, it had cost the taxpayers of Ashby $200 in repairs. It was costing them quite enough to incarcerate Kent Castwell, as it was, although the judge had reduced the cost by ordering the sentences to run concurrently. All in all, Kent spent over a month in jail that winter at various times. It seemed to some that whenever his money ran out, he let the county support him and let the woman and the child fend for themselves. Tom Tolley gave them a little credit at the store. Not much. Ed Westlake, when he bid again for the school bus contract, added the cost of going 3 miles out of his way to pick up Kathy. The county had no choice but to meet the extra charge. It was considered very thoughtless of Louise to wait until after the contract was signed before leaving Castwell and taking her daughter and going back to the city. The side road to the Peabody place didn't have to be plowed so often, but it still had to be plowed some. That extra cost, just for one man, it was maddening. It almost seemed, no, it did seem, as if Kent Castwell were deliberately setting himself in the face of New England respectability and thrift. The sacred words, "eat it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without," didn't mean a thing to him. He wasn't just indifferent. He was hostile. Ashby was not a thriving place. It had no industries. It was not a resort town, being far from the sea and the mountains alike, with only the shallow, muddy waters of Lake Amanstanquet for a pleasure spot. Its thin-soiled farms and meager woodlots produced a scanty return for the hard labor exacted. Young people continued to leave. Kent Castwell, unfortunately, showed no signs of leaving. All things considered, it was not surprising that Ashby had no artists' colony. It was rather surprising, then, that Clem Goodhue, meeting the train with his taxi, recognized Bob Laurel at once as an artist. When he was asked afterwards how he had known, Clem looked smug and said that he had once been to Provincetown. The conversation, as Clem recalled it afterwards, began with Bob Laurel's asking where he could find a house that offered low rent, peace and quiet, and a place to paint. "So I recommended Kent Castwell," Clem said. He was talking to Sheriff Erastus Nickerson, Levi P.'s cousin, at the time. "Peace and quiet," the sheriff repeated. "I know Laurel's a city fellow and an artist, but still and all." They were seated at the bar of the Ashby House, drinking their weekly small glass of beer. "I looked at it this way, Erastus," the taxi man said. "Sure, there's empty houses all around that he could rent. Suppose he, this artist fellow, suppose he picks one off on a side road with nobody else living on it. Suppose he comes up with a wife out of somewhere, and suppose she has a school-age child." "You're right, Clem. Of course I'm right. Bad enough for the county to put all that cost for one house, let alone 2. "You're right, Clem. But will he stay with Castwell?" Clem shrugged. "That I can't say, but I did my best." Laurel stayed with Castwell. He really had no choice. The big man agreed to take him in as a lodger and to give over the front room for a studio, and holding out offers of insulating the house, putting in another window, and who knows what else, Kent Castwell persuaded the poor unwary artist to pay several months' rent in advance. Needless to say, he drank up the money, and he did nothing at all in the way of promised improvements. Neither District Attorney Gamaliel Coolidge, nor Sheriff Nickerson, nor, for that matter, anyone else, showed Laurel much sympathy. He had grounds for a civil suit, they said, nothing else. Should be a lesson to him not to throw his money around in the future, they said. So the unhappy artist stayed on at the old Peabody place, buying his own food and cutting his own wood and painting. And all the time he knew full well that his leering landlord only waited for him to go into town in order to help himself to both food and wood. Laurel invited Clem to have a glass of beer with him more than once, just to have someone to tell his troubles to. Besides stealing his food and his fuel, Kent Castwell, it seemed, played the TV at full blast when Laurel wanted to sleep. If it was too late for TV, he set the radio to roaring. At moments when the artist was intent on delicate brushwork, Castwell would decide to bring in stove wood and drop it hard on the floor so that the whole house shook. "He talks to himself in that loud, rough voice of his," Bob Laurel complained. "He has a filthy mouth. He makes fun of my painting. I'll tell you what it is," Clem said. "Kent Castwell has no consideration for others. That's what it is. Yep." Bets were taken in town, of a 10-cent cigar per bet, on how long Laurel would stand for it. Levi Nickerson, the county tax assessor, thought he'd leave as soon as his rent was up. Clem's opinion was that he would leave sooner. "Money don't mean that much to city people," he pointed out. Clem won. When he came into Nickerson's house, Levi, who was sitting close to the small fire in the kitchen stove, wordlessly handed over the 10-cent cigar. Clem nodded and put it in his pocket. Mrs. Abby Nickerson sat next to her husband, wearing a man's sweater. It had belonged to her late father, whose heart had failed to survive the first re-election of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it still had a lot of wear left in it. Abby was unraveling old socks and winding the wool into a ball. "Waste not, want not," was her motto, as well as that of every other old-time local resident. On the stove, a kettle steamed thinly. 2 piles of used envelopes were on the table. They had all been addressed to the tax assessor's office of the county and had been carefully opened so as not to mutilate them. While Clem watched, Levi Nickerson removed one of the envelopes from its place on top of the uncovered kettle. The mucilage on its flaps loosened by steam, it opened out easily to Nickerson's touch. He proceeded to refold it and then reseal it so that the used outside was now on the inside, and then he added it to the other pile. "Saved the county $11 this way last year," he observed. "I shouldn't wonder but what I don't make it 12 this year, maybe 12.50. Clem gave a small, appreciative grunt. "Where is he?" the tax assessor asked. "Laurel? He's in the Ashby bar. He's all packed. I told him to stay put. I told them to keep an eye on him. Phone me here if he made a move to leave." He took a sheet of paper out of his pocket and put it on the table. Levi looked at it, but made no move to pick it up. To his wife, he said, "I'm expecting Erastus and Gam Coolidge over, Mrs. Nickerson. County business. I expect you can find something to do in the front of the house while we talk." Mrs. Nickerson nodded. Even words were not wasted by her. A car drove up to the house. "That's Erastus," said his cousin. "Gam should be along. He is along. I might have known he wouldn't waste gasoline. He came with Erastus." The 2 men came into the kitchen. Mrs. Abby Nickerson rose and departed. "Hope we can get this over with before nightfall," the sheriff said. "I don't like to drive after dark if I can help it. One of my headlights is getting dim, and they cost so much to replace." Clem cleared his throat. "Well, here it is," he said, gesturing to the paper on the table. "Laurel's confession. Tell the sheriff and the DA that I'm ready to give myself up," he said. "I wrote it all down here," he said. "Happened about 2 o'clock this afternoon, I guess. Straw that broke the camel's back. Kent Castwell, he was acting up as usual, stomping and swearing out there at the Peabody place. Words were exchanged. Laurel left to go out back," Clem said delicately, not needing to further comment on the Peabody place's lack of indoor plumbing. "When he came back, Castwell had taken the biggest brush he could find and smeared paint over all of the pictures Laurel had been working on. Ruined them completely." There was a moment's silence. "Castwell had no call to do that," the sheriff said, "destroying another man's property. They tell me some of those artists get as much as $100 for a painting. What did he do then? Laurel, I mean." "He picked up a piece of stove wood, and he hit him with it. He hit him hard." "No doubt about his being dead, I suppose?" the sheriff asked. Clem shook his head. "There was no blood or anything on the wood," he added. "Just another piece of stove wood, but he's dead all right." After a moment, Levi Nickerson said, "His wife will have to be notified. No reason why the county should have to pay burial expenses. I expect she won't have any money, though. Best get in touch with those trustees who sent Castwell his money every month. They'll pay." Gamaliel Coolidge asked if anyone else knew. Clem said no. Bob Laurel hadn't told anyone else. He didn't seem to want to talk. This time, there was a longer silence. "Do you realize how much Kent Castwell cost this county, one way or the other?" Nickerson said. Clem said he supposed hundreds of dollars. "Hundreds and hundreds of dollars," Nickerson said. "And," the tax assessor went on, "do you know what it will cost us to try this fellow for murder in any degree or manslaughter?" The district attorney said it would cost thousands. Thousands and thousands. "And that's just the trial," he elaborated. "Suppose he's found guilty and he appeals. We'd be obliged to fight the appeal. More thousands. And suppose he gets a new trial. We'd have to pay it all over again." Levi P. Nickerson opened his mouth as though it hurt him to do so. "What it would do to the county tax rate," he groaned. "Kent Castwell," he said, his voice becoming crisp and definite, "is not worth it. He is just not worth it." Clem took out the 10-cent cigar he'd won and sniffed it. "My opinion," he said, "it would have been much better if this fellow Laurel had just packed up and left. Anybody finding Castwell's body now would assume he'd fallen, hit his head. But this confession now." Sheriff Erastus Nickerson said reflectively, "I haven't read any confession. You, Gam? You, Levi? No. What you've told us, Clem, is just hearsay. Can't act on hearsay, totally contrary to all the principles of American law." "That's a mighty nice sunset," he said deliberately, and he arose and he walked over to the window. His cousin stood and followed him. So did District Attorney Coolidge. While they were looking out the window at the sunset, Clem Goodhue, after a single glance at their three backs lined up in a row, took the sheet of paper from the kitchen table and thrust it into the kitchen stove. There was a flare of light. It quickly died down. Clem carefully reached his hand into the stove, took out the small corner of the paper remaining, and lit his 10-cent cigar with it. The three men turned from the window. Levi P. Nickerson was the first to speak. "I can't ask any of you to stay to supper," he said. "Just a few leftovers. That's all we're having. I expect you'll want to be going on your way. It's getting dark." The two other county officials nodded. The taxi man said, "I believe I'll stop by the Ashby bar. There might be someone there wanting to catch the evening train." "Good night, Levi. Don't bother to turn the yard light on for us." "I wasn't going to," said Levi. "Turning them on and off, that's what burns them out." "Good night, Clem, Gam, Erastus." He closed the door after them. "Mrs. Nickerson," he called to his wife, "you can come and start supper now. We have finished our Kent Castwell business." And that is the end of this week's story. I hope you enjoyed it. Until the next time we talk, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and be well. Goodbye.